Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video today is we're going to be looking at constructing answers. Now, what we're going to be looking at it in terms of is we're going to be looking at it in terms of a practical example. Now, the reason why we're going to look at it in terms of a practical example is obviously the best and the easiest way to learn is by doing. And what we're going to look at is basically give you a question, give you a text, which we're going to base our answer on, and put it all together in a way that you would normally do and apply it in a way that you'll be able to apply it to any other text or any other question you are given. So basically just going through the process of developing and constructing your answer, putting it all together basically. Alright, so let's have a look. So the idea is we're making connections, and this is really what we're looking at in this video, and it's pretty much the entire process of constructing an answer is making connections between things, and notably that is between the answer itself, the text, and the question. So in other words, once you get a question, as in you read it, then your goal is to connect whatever is written in that question to, first of all, an answer, as in you have an argument and things that you can discuss, and second of all, the text, the thing that you're going to be basing your answer on. And you're going to put them together in such a way that you can say you fully answered it. So we're going to go through a step-by-step process of this. We're going to go through the mental process, and we're going to go through basically the construction process. So from start to finish, and basically all the things that you would think about as you're putting your answer together. Okay, so let's have a look at the text first of all. Now, in this process, I'll give you a bit of time to read it as well, and I'll read it as well. But basically the text we're going to use is Robert Frost's Fire and Ice. Now the text goes, some will say the world will end with fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favour fire. But if I had to perish twice, I would think I know enough of hate to know that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. Okay, so reading that, and I might have skipped a word here or there, but reading that, it is a poem, it is a very short poem, that's the entire text right there. And it has a number of different ideas sort of intertwined into it. So we need to also focus on not only on interpreting it, but actually choosing which one's the best. And we'll go through that process as well. It's a concise 9-line poem that basically examines human nature and an age-old question about how the world may end. And it's basically the context of this poem, what it's based on, is based on this sort of question about how at the time particularly, people and scientists thought that the world would end, and some said that it would end with a big fireball where the earth would explode or the sun would explode, one of the two, and we'd all be burned alive, or a big ice age where everyone would freeze to death. So basically it was that. And Frost sort of tweaked this idea and made it into something about humanity and made it about us, made it about people. So to go for a basic overview of what the poem's about, that's it. However, that may not necessarily help our interpretation, and certainly for the question that we're looking at, is not going to. The human nature point is one we're going to focus on in our question, because it probably is the most interesting aspect. So we're not going to focus on it so much in terms of the world ending, although that will come and form a part of our answer. We're mainly focusing on terms of how it answers to human nature, and basically what it says about us. Okay, so the question is, discuss how Frost's poem Fire and Ice reflects human nature. Now, it's a fairly broad and straightforward question, and the problem is that it requires us to not only make some connections, but also that there is more than one answer. So you need to connect the idea of essentially text and human nature. You need to put those two things together, and that's a little bit difficult to do, seeing as I just told you the poem's about the world ending. So how does that really refer to human nature if it's just about what we consider to be the world ending? Well, it can mean a number of things, and that's what the interpretation of the poem's all about. Now, as I said, there are many possible answers here, but we need to really focus on one, and the reason for that is, first of all, if we're doing a short answer question, then you're only going to be able to fit in one possible answer. You're not going to have multiple main ideas, you're going to have one. But second of all is, the more you can stick to one main idea, the easier it is to refine that main idea and to use it in such a way where you're able to elaborate on it, discuss it, explain it, and so on. So that you don't have a number of conflicting ideas or even things that aren't really relevant to the idea of human nature. And don't forget, this question is about human nature. So we need to focus on it purely in terms of what this poem says about humans and humanity. And that's really what we're focusing on. And anything else that's important, that's artistic, that's great about the poem, we have to discard it. That's not to say that it's not relevant at all, it's just to say it's not relevant for this question and we need to ignore it. So, step 2. Now, usually the panic stations come in, which is why we crossed out panic and we're thinking about thinking. And that's mainly what we're trying to do at this point, is not panic, but think about it. Now, normally if you get given poetry, I know that the standard response for a lot of students is to basically to panic and go, oh my God, it's a poem and I need to work out what this means. And yes, the temptation is, oh, I need to ask a teacher. Well, this is something you can do yourself. And certainly, the more you practice doing it yourself, and certainly the better you get at doing it yourself, makes it much easier to talk about it and even to use other people's words, because you're able to use your own and substitute your own where necessary. And particularly, it makes it much easier. So, human nature. What are we going to say about human nature about this poem? We've got a lot of things about fire and ice, but it doesn't actually really refer to humans apart from the persona who says I. So, okay, we know he's in the poem, but we don't know anyone else. How is this relating to human nature? Okay, where can we find it in this passage? That's the other question. Well, there are 2 key words that stand out, which is basically hate and desire. Now, why do they stand out? They're emotions. Simple as that. They are emotional responses. Now, emotional responses are something that humans do. It's something that's personified. So, by giving fire and ice these qualities of desire and desire and hatred, then what we're doing is we're personifying them. So, we're basically attaching fire to desire and we're attaching hate to ice. So, by doing those things, we're suddenly making it personified. And personifying the poem, Frost has done something which has enabled us to make a discussion about human nature. Just purely based on those 2 words being there. If those 2 words weren't there, then we may be thinking of a different kind of question. But in this case, because of the fact that there's desire and hatred mentioned, then there's something that's being said about human nature, which when we look deeply into it, we'll be able to find something. Now, this interpretation can change depending on who you are and what you believe this poem to mean, and certainly depending on the context. But really, what you're looking at in this case is something that will give you an answer for why it is about human nature. Okay, so the connection. Well, emotions are part of human nature, so we know that. And to attach them to bipolar nature, and we say bipolar because it's between 2 opposites, suggests that something about the 2. So if we're attaching emotions to opposites, and we're attaching the idea of fire and ice to opposites, then what does it say about humans? Well, the persona prefers one side or the other. And we get that through the opposites. As in, we've got one side, the desire side, the side of passion and fury, and then we've got the other side of hate, of bitterness, of regret, of almost aloofness, shyness, those sorts of things. Even though both are okay, he prefers to sort of go out with a bang rather than a slow death sort of thing. So, but that's not to say that he completely doesn't acknowledge the other side. And in this case, it's sort of acknowledging that, yes, there are people who are divided, but yet they also have a bit of the other in them. So people who have ice have a little bit of fire in them, and people who have fire have a little bit of ice in them, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of things being mentioned, but we need to start to refine this into an argument. We'll do that in a second. We need to ask this question first. With all these things that we've just mentioned, what do you think this is trying to what point does this make about human nature? What is this meaning? Well, let's have a look at it. The poem may be about the world ending, and yes, it is about the world ending, but it can also relate to other things that could end. Now, if we're thinking emotions, and we're thinking between 2 different groups of people, and yes, we could talk about that stark contrast between people as an element of human nature, and that's one of the arguments you could come up with, but we've got a different one in this case, which is relationships. And particularly, it speaks about the close relationships between 2 people, particularly with the closeness of these 2 things. As in, fire and ice are very close together, and particularly within the poet. So by looking at relationships, we can get a very good grasp of what this poem is trying to communicate. Now, people are represented as being fiery, as I mentioned before, very ferocious, very passionate, sort of go out with a bang, go things a million miles an hour. And ice, quiet, bitter, reserved, shy, all those things. So there's two different contrasts, and as I mentioned, they can overlap. And certainly in the case of the persona, they do overlap. It reflects the differences, and as I said, in the vision between people. And particularly when you look at relationships building. And yes, there is a statement, opposites attract, but also opposites do their best to repel people, and certainly people are joined by common interests. So it's really sort of highlighting the way that people can divide themselves. And particularly in the case of fire and ice, we've got two distinct groups. And as I mentioned, with the qualities of people in each group, we've basically got the two distinct sides, and then we've sort of got the grey area in between, which I think covers virtually all of us. So even though there are two distinct sides, there's this very big blurry barrier in between. But it also highlights the differences and the reasons why particularly relationships break down. And that may be a main point for the argument here, is that relationships are basically, they join because of the fact that people bring different things to each other, but they also break down for that reason. So when we start to put it all together, we can start to make a number of conclusions. So we've rephrased the question here. How does fire and ice represent human nature? It does a couple of things. First of all, human nature is basically another way of saying relationships. The way we relate to each other. And that's something that is a huge part of human nature, is that we have relationships with each other. Secondly, it represents relationships through personification of fire and ice, which we just mentioned. And certainly, this is how it's represented. Now, we don't need to go into depth about this because it's really just asking how it represents human nature, not arguing it. So, even though we're arguing it in the sense that we're proving it belongs to human nature, we don't have to go any further than that. We can pretty much just stick to that argument. If we were extending it over a longer response, we'd probably get a little bit more to the question, which is argue how this is the case. Where in this case, we're just making a short and very brief statement about how these two connect. Finally, the symbolic representation of division of people, contrasting it with two possible endings. So when we talk about relationships again, and we're putting it in perspective of this, then our relationships can either end in a big fiery fireball. So if you imagine if it's a couple, either a married couple or just a boyfriend and girlfriend or whatever the case may be, then yes, it could explode in a big fireball, as in very fiery, clothes thrown out the window, all those old cliches, or very cold and bitter, and people just grow steadily apart from each other. And it's not so much it goes out with a bang, which is fast and furious, but it goes over a long time. It's a very slow and drawn out process, which is pretty much how we're looking at it in terms of an ice age. An ice age wouldn't kill us overnight as much as the exploding sun or the exploding earth would. That's a very quick thing. We'd almost go without realizing it. Whereas in the case of ice, we'd be very much aware of it because it will get cold very steadily, and then it will get so cold that we basically freeze to death, and even that's a slow process. So having those two possible endings sort of indicates how people can relate, the relationships, and ultimately human nature, and that's where we've made the connection back to again. So to summarize, we've basically got this question. Our answer is relating to this personification and this symbolism. And the text is basically referring to this idea of endings, again the symbolism, which is sort of overlapping between the text, as in the text uses the symbols of fire and ice. And then it drags it all back together to this idea of how does this poem represent human nature. And through an argument, now this is a very simplistic representation of what the argument would be. Obviously you need to expand this through sentences, you need to go into depth with it, and depending on the length of your response or how long it actually needs to be, you would go into detail depending on exactly how much you're supposed to write for it. So if you're asked to write 1,000 words, easy, there's enough there to actually be able to do that. But you need to expand a little bit more than if you're doing 200 words. Alright, so that's about it. So going through those processes, you should be a little bit aware of the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about, and indeed, as this is a practice-based thing, looking at it in terms of, okay, we've got the text, and pretty much in the time we've had from seeing it, we've got interpretation down, we've got our main ideas, and we've got an answer which we can then use for any kind of response that we're asked to give. So that's pretty much it. So until next time, I'll see you later.